The Viking raids didn't just take land or gold. Sometimes they erased people. We all picture Vikings as raiders on the shoreline, long ships, axes, and sudden flames. But what if the raids did more than kill? What if they erased people in a way that leaves almost no voice in the written record? That is the question behind the title. What happened to a captured queen, or to any high-status woman, consecrated woman, or anonymous captive, when she became part of ritual and market systems that the chronicles rarely name? The sources are silent in ink. The earth is not. The fragments of metal, the patterns in timber, the chemistry locked in teeth and soil, and the empty spaces where a name should be all begin to sketch a picture that can be unsettling precisely because it is incomplete. Look closely at the ports and marketplaces of the Viking Age, and you begin to see infrastructure that can be read as adapted for keeping and selling people. At sites like Dublin and Hedeby, archaeologists have recovered iron rings and shackles, not as battlefield debris but in contexts consistent with storage and movement. Timber floors with repeated repairs, aligned post holes that suggest penned enclosures, and long rectangular foundation features that could function as warehouses point to spaces designed to hold things, and sometimes to hold people. Small metal tokens and standardized weights found in market precincts suggest economic systems where value was negotiated in object form. Taken together, these features do not prove that every port was a slave market, but they strongly indicate that human beings were one category among commodities handled by those systems. This is where we must be precise about types of evidence. Material culture, the shackles, the tokens, the pen-like post-hole arrangements, is archaeological. It tells us about activities and infrastructure. It does not, by itself, tell us the intent behind every act. Documentary traces, occasional annal entries, monastery chronicles, and law codes sometimes describe captives, ransoms, and trade in human beings. They are written by people with their own priorities, often focusing on treasure, bishops, and relics. Biochemical and bioarchaeological lines of evidence, isotopes and ancient DNA, offer a different angle. They can show movement, ancestry, and place of upbringing. When these lines converge, the case for routinized capture and transport grows stronger. When they diverge, we must accept ambiguity. If archaeology provides the stage, bioarchaeology gives us actors in a limited way. Strontium isotope analysis is a method that reads the chemical signature in tooth enamel to estimate where a person spent their childhood, because the ratio of certain isotopes in drinking water and food varies by geology and is incorporated into teeth in youth. Ancient DNA, or ADNA, allows researchers to compare genetic markers and infer ancestry and kinship patterns. At several Scandinavian cemeteries, researchers have reported female remains whose strontium or genetic signatures indicate origins in Britain, Ireland, or other non-local regions. That pattern is hard to reconcile with a model in which all buried women were lifelong local residents. It suggests movement of women across the North Sea, sometimes voluntary, sometimes forced. Yet neither strontium nor ADNA can tell us the social story by themselves, whether the move was as a rewarded marriage, a political hostage exchange, a captive held for ransom, or enslavement. We must weigh these data alongside archaeological and documentary context. Urban sites add further texture. York, known in its Viking-era phase as Jorvik, produced evidence interpreted by some specialists as small enclosures and structural features that could serve to restrain movement temporarily. Inland monastic sites such as Repton, where the interplay of burial contexts, skeletal trauma patterns, and disturbed earth has prompted intense debate, show how violence and hurried disposal sometimes intersect with sacred spaces. In several monastic and parish contexts across the British Isles and Scandinavia, archaeologists have identified graves that lack customary markers, are shallow, or are otherwise atypical for the care normally afforded to the dead in those communities. Such anomalous burial treatment is a form of social evidence. It speaks to which deaths were followed by ritual recognition and which were not. Patterns of trauma in skeletal assemblages can suggest constrained movement or violence prior to death. But again, interpretation requires caution. A broken limb, healed or unhealed, an injury consistent with immobilization, or evidence of binding can be read in multiple ways. Some contexts suggest hurried disposal after battle or raid. Others are consistent with executions, and others with post-mortem disturbance. For ethical and evidentiary reasons, scholars avoid lurid reconstructions. The important point is that these patterns, when present alongside market infrastructure and documentary hints, form a convergent argument that goes beyond isolated violence. They point toward practices where captives were treated as commodities, and, in some cases, as social others whose previous identities were stripped. Chemical residues complicate the story further. Analyses of soils, grave fillings, and residues on artifacts have occasionally detected plant alkaloids and trace amounts of mercury. Plant alkaloids are a broad class of compounds found in many plants. Some can be toxic or sedating, others medicinal. Mercury enters archaeological contexts through a range of routes: medicinal remedies, metallurgy, tanning, or environmental contamination from industrial processes. Scholars have suggested several interpretations where alkaloids or mercury appear in association with human remains or equipment linked to captivity. Accidental contamination, medicinal treatment, ritual anointing, or deliberate incapacitation. None of these explanations is a settled fact. The detection of such chemicals raises hypotheses about incapacitation practices, possibly to make captives tractable during transport or confinement. But the interpretation is provisional and requires careful contextual study. The chemistry is suggestive. It is not determinative. To understand how these practices could have been normalized, we must look at legal and economic frameworks, Old Norse law codes, fragments of transactional records, and some contemporaneous writings make clear that captive taking and slavery were institutionally present in many early medieval North Sea societies. Captives could be enslaved, ransomed, gifted, or absorbed into households. Markets developed rules and instruments to exchange value. A captive's legal status mattered. A woman taken in raid might be formally listed as a thrall in one jurisdiction, a wife in another, and a hostage or bargaining chip in a third. Economically, human beings had a calculable value in certain transactions. Legally, their status could be negotiated. That does not mean that every Viking community endorsed mass enslavement. Local variation was vast. But the presence of marketable instruments and legal categories made the commodification of persons a legible, routinized possibility. One of the most morally charged interpretive moves scholars must navigate is defining what is meant by worse than death. This phrase is not meant to diminish physical killing, but to highlight a different kind of harm: social and spiritual erasure. Death removes a person from life. Erasure removes the person from memory, identity, ritual belonging, and testimony. When a consecrated woman, a nun, an abbess, a woman recognized in her community by vows and ritual role, is taken and then stripped of those rights, when her relics are looted and her communal role is denied, the injury is not only bodily, it is the severing of a life story from public memory. When burials are anonymized, when chronicles omit the names of women taken in raids while fussing over stolen gold or relics, when offspring of mixed-status unions are assimilated without acknowledgement, the social continuity that undergirds identity is interrupted. In those terms, erasure can be a harm that outlives a single lifetime. It severs testimony, obliterates belonging, and complicates any future claims for restitution or commemoration. Cases of deliberate erasure show up across multiple kinds of evidence. In some monastic chronicles, observers note with outrage the theft of relics and the capture of sisters. But their accounts often focus on the loss of treasure rather than on the women themselves. In the archaeological record, we sometimes find burials of people who, by isotopic or genetic markers, appear non-local and are interred without the markers or care accorded to local elites. In other instances, children born of captive unions are assimilated into the captor's social world, their maternal lineage quietly obscured. These strands, taken together, support an interpretation in which the social identities of captives were targeted for removal or replacement, a process that scholars reasonably call erasure. Certain hypotheses push beyond the evidence we currently have, and it is essential to treat them as hypotheses. Some researchers and commentators have suggested systematic programs of forced reproduction, the so-called breeding hypothesis, or the routine use of poisons to incapacitate captives. These are ethically provocative ideas with modern resonances, but they remain controversial among specialists. The documentary record offers little in the way of routine prescriptions for either practice, and the archaeological and biochemical signals are ambiguous. Claims about systematic reproduction require evidence of sustained demographic strategies, such as consistent patterns of enforced reproductive pairings, or institutional records describing such programs, evidence that we do not have in robust form. Likewise, chemical residues are open to multiple readings. Responsible scholarship therefore treats these suggestions as plausible lines of inquiry rather than settled historical facts. They demand multidisciplinary, fine-grained work, combining archaeology, chemistry, history, and ethical reflection, before they can be accepted or dismissed. There are, however, documented instances of resistance, rescue, and recovery that complicate the image of total erasure. The annals and some saga material record ransoms paid, flanking raids launched to free captives, and legal claims mounted on behalf of abducted kin. Saga narratives mention figures who lead reprisals or negotiate the return of women, and while such accounts are shaped by literary aims and are not straightforward historical reportage, they preserve a memory of social action taken to contest captivity. In the archaeological record, sporadic evidence of restored burial practices or of returning communities reclaiming local cemeteries hints at efforts to restore disrupted lines of memory. These episodes matter. They show that erasure was not inevitable and that communities sometimes fought back to reclaim identity, ritual status, and testimony. As we weigh these converging traces, the obligation falls upon modern researchers, curators, and storytellers to frame the past responsibly. Museums and public historians must avoid displays that sensationalize suffering or reduce people to objects of curiosity. Exhibitions should foreground context, explain levels of certainty, and resist transforming victims into spectacles. Publications and media should prioritize accessible presentation of primary data, so that interested lay audiences and specialists alike can evaluate claims. Ethical obligations extend to how we name and remember those who do not have surviving names. Respectful language, attention to provenance, and collaboration with communities of descent or local stakeholders are minimal standards. Methodologically, the way forward is clear: more interdisciplinary work, greater transparency in data sharing, and incremental argumentation. Strontium and oxygen isotopes together can sharpen geographic inferences. ADNA can reveal kinship patterns that challenge easy narratives of assimilation. High-resolution chemical analyses combined with careful stratigraphic study can tease out whether a residue is from medicinal ointment, tanning, or something else. Archaeometry, careful excavation, and a willingness to publish negative results will all improve historical reconstructions. Crucially, interpretive humility must accompany technical sophistication. We should celebrate what the science can tell us and acknowledge its limits. We should also be attentive to the specific case the title raises: a captured queen in a ritual context. Royal or noble women, when seized, had multiplied value: political, symbolic, economic. A queen captured in raid could be used to legitimize claims, exchanged as part of negotiated settlements, presented in rituals of domination, or stripped of her ceremonial role. Where she was integrated into the captor's world, her previous office might be denied and her memory displaced. Where she was held as a bargaining chip, her personhood might be treated instrumentally. In some literary sources, the capture of high-status women becomes a narrative device to mark a reversal of fortune. In the archaeological record, corresponding signals of forced displacement, anonymized burial, or marked absence in contemporary texts may represent the material consequences of those symbolic acts. Again, though, each case requires independent scrutiny. We cannot project a single universal script onto all captured elite women across the entire North Sea world. Finally, the moral judgment embedded in calling some practices worse than death requires careful definition. If we use that phrase to mean the willful removal of a person's social and ritual identity, the deliberate stripping of memory, voice, family ties, and communal recognition, then the claim can be evaluated against evidence. Anonymized graves, disrupted liturgical roles, lack of name in chronicles, and assimilation of children without acknowledgement are empirical markers of erasure. Where such markers cluster with evidence for marketplace commodification and constrained mobility, the conclusion that certain practices inflicted harms that outlasted death becomes plausible. It is not a statement that replaces the horror of killing. It is an ethical reading that highlights an additional and long-lasting form of violence: the destruction of testimony and belonging. This is not history for the thrill of the grim. It is a sober reorientation of what gets remembered and why. The stones and soils, when read carefully alongside texts and chemistry, press us to ask whose stories were allowed to survive and whose were silenced. The task for scholars and for public audiences is to reconstruct those fractured lives with rigor and restraint, to avoid sensationalism, and to restore, where possible, names and context to people whom prior records erased. If this subject matters to you, please consider subscribing. It supports careful research and makes primary sources more available to everyone. The provocation of the title was not an accusation against an undifferentiated people, but an invitation to look at systems, legal, economic, and ritual practices that made human capture legible and sometimes durable. The archaeological ledger, shackles in markets, pen-like post patterns, warehouse traces, combined with bioarchaeological hints of non-local women in Scandinavian cemeteries, and the occasional chemical anomalies, together argue that capture and removal of identity were part of some episodes of Viking-era life. But the record is partial. Many claims remain provisional, and provocative hypotheses like systematic breeding or routine poisoning require far more evidence before they can move from conjecture to consensus. There is an ethical afterlife to this research. Museums should present finds with contextual nuance and avoid imagery that re-victimizes. Archaeologists should prioritize transparent data sharing and engage with descendant and local communities. Journalists and documentarians should resist certainties where evidence is equivocal. Remembering those who were taken means more than reassembling bones and measuring isotopes. It means restoring names where possible, acknowledging absence where not, and insisting that history's ledger include the silences as part of the record. The stones may not speak in words. They speak through patterns. The earth keeps a quieter ledger than the annals. Reading that ledger demands caution, empathy, and a readiness to revise our stories. What happened to a captured queen in ritual and market contexts sometimes did go beyond what ink admits. Not in every case, and not as a blanket claim about entire peoples, but enough times and in enough ways that historians, archaeologists, and the public must confront the implications. If you want to explore the scholarship behind this narrative, the description below includes links to primary reports, excavation summaries, and accessible introductions to strontium isotope and aDNA methods. Share this video with someone who cares about recovered voices, and consider approaching this history with sober attention and respect.